The tape recorder kept running after midnight. Nobody told it to stop. In a Los Angeles studio in the spring of 1973, the cameras for Chuck Berry's Born to Rock television special had been packed away hours ago. The crew had left. The producers had gone home. But in Studio B, two men remained. Chuck Berry sat on a stool with his Gibson ES-335, and Marvin Gaye stood at the microphone, still wearing the suit from the taping. Neither of them planned to stay. Neither of them knew what was about to happen. The official recording session had been professional and controlled. Marvin had performed 2 songs from his catalog for Berry's show, hitting his marks, delivering the smooth romantic vocals that Motown had spent years perfecting. Berry had been the gracious host, introducing Marvin as the Prince of Soul, asking rehearsed questions about his career, his influences, his process. Everything had gone exactly as scripted. But throughout the taping, Marvin had felt the familiar weight pressing down on him. The weight of expectation, the weight of the image Berry Gordy had constructed. He had smiled when required, moved when directed, performed the version of himself that audiences expected. Yet something about being in Chuck Berry's presence made the performance feel heavier than usual. Berry represented something Marvin had left behind, or perhaps had never been allowed to fully explore. A rawness, a freedom, a refusal to be polished into something safer. When the filming ended and the studio cleared, something shifted. Chuck stayed, Marvin stayed, and the real conversation began. Berry had been watching Marvin all day, during rehearsals, during takes, during breaks. He saw something underneath the polished Motown exterior that interested him. After everyone left, he looked at Marvin and said, "You ever play rock and roll?" The question hung in the air. Marvin smiled but didn't answer immediately. His relationship with rock and roll was complicated. Motown had built his career on soul and R&B, carefully crafting an image of romantic sophistication. But before Motown, before the hits, before the world knew his name, Marvin had been a kid in Washington, D.C., listening to Chuck Berry records, learning guitar licks, dreaming of the freedom that came with 3 chords and a backbeat. "Not in a long time," Marvin finally said. Chuck nodded, understanding more than what was spoken. He started playing the opening riff to Johnny B. Goode. Just him and the guitar, no accompaniment, no production, no arrangement. The sound filled the empty studio, raw, direct, unfiltered. Marvin stood at the microphone listening, and for the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. The urge to let go, to stop performing and just play. Berry kept playing, looking at Marvin, a silent invitation. And then Marvin started singing, not the Chuck Berry lyrics, not the original melody. He took the structure of Johnny B. Goode and bent it into something else. His voice dropped into a lower register, adding a gospel texture to the rock foundation. The words came differently, slower, with more space between the lines. He was turning rock and roll into soul in real time, proving that the distance between the genres was smaller than anyone realized. Chuck Berry smiled, adjusted his playing to follow Marvin's lead, and the two of them locked into a groove that nobody had written, nobody had arranged, nobody had approved. The studio engineer, a young man named David who had been packing cables in the back room, heard the sound and stopped. He walked to the control booth and saw what was happening through the glass. 2 legends off the clock, creating something spontaneous. He made a decision that would haunt him for decades. He turned on the tape machine, he hit record, and he captured what happened next. For the next 45 minutes, Marvin and Chuck explored Johnny B. Goode in ways that defied categorization. They played it fast, then slow. They added call and response sections where Chuck would sing a line and Marvin would answer with a variation. They experimented with time signatures, with dynamics, with spaces where silence did as much work as sound. Chuck's guitar playing was sharp and percussive, driving the rhythm forward, while Marvin's vocals floated above it, adding melody and emotion. At one point, they stopped completely, laughed about a mistake, and then dove back in with even more intensity. What made the session remarkable wasn't technical perfection. There were missed notes, timing issues, moments where they clearly lost sync and had to find their way back. But what they captured was something more valuable than polish. They captured the sound of two artists who had spent their entire careers being told what to do, how to sound, what was commercial, finally being free. For those 45 minutes, there were no producers, no label executives, no image consultants, just two musicians communicating in the only language that mattered. Midway through the session, Marvin stopped singing and started talking. Not to Chuck directly, but into the microphone, as if he were speaking to someone who wasn't there. He talked about how music had saved him as a kid, how Chuck Berry's records had shown him that black artists could own the stage, could command attention, could create something that transcended race and genre and expectation. He talked about how Motown had given him a career but had also put him in a box, how every song he recorded was filtered through so many people, so many decisions, so many compromises, how he sometimes forgot what his own voice sounded like without all the production, all the arrangement, all the carefully constructed sweetening. Chuck listened, still playing quietly underneath Marvin's words, and when Marvin finished, Berry said something that the tape captured perfectly. "You sound more like yourself right now than you did all day." Marvin went quiet. Then he started singing again, this time with even less restraint, letting his voice crack, letting rough edges show, allowing himself to be imperfect and human and real. The final version of Johnny B. Goode they created that night bore almost no resemblance to the original. It had become a hybrid, part rock anthem, part soul confession, part gospel testimony. Chuck's guitar provided the skeleton, but Marvin's voice was the flesh and blood. They recorded it 3 times, each version different, each one revealing something new about what happened when two different musical traditions collided and merged. When they finally stopped, it was past 2 in the morning. Chuck set his guitar down. Marvin stepped away from the microphone. They looked at each other, both understanding that something significant had just occurred, but neither quite sure what to do with it. The engineer, David, came out of the control booth with the tape reels. "You need to hear this," he said. They listened back to portions of the session, and the reaction was the same from both men. Silence, not disappointment, not dissatisfaction, but recognition. They had created something that didn't fit anywhere. It was too raw for commercial release, too experimental for Berry's television show, too rock for Marvin's audience, too soul for Berry's traditionalist fans. "Nobody's going to know what to do with this," Chuck said. Marvin nodded. "Motown would never let me release it." They sat in the studio for another hour discussing possibilities. Maybe they could clean it up, add production, make it more palatable. But every solution felt like a betrayal of what they'd captured. The beauty of the recording was its roughness, its spontaneity, its refusal to be anything other than what it was. Eventually, they made a decision. The tape would stay in the studio archives, unlabeled, uncatalogued, a secret between the 3 people who were there that night. Chuck didn't want to deal with the legal complications of releasing something recorded after his TV production had wrapped. Marvin couldn't afford another conflict with Motown, which was already frustrated with his increasing desire for creative control. And David, the engineer, understood that some moments weren't meant to be sold. They were meant to exist as proof that something magical had happened, even if the world never knew. Years later, David would tell the story to fellow engineers, to music journalists, to anyone who would listen. He described the session in detail, the way Marvin's voice had transformed rock and roll, the way Chuck's guitar had bent to accommodate soul phrasing, the way 2 different musical languages had found common ground. But he never produced the tape. He claimed it was lost in a studio fire in 1979. Others said it had been deliberately destroyed to prevent bootlegging. Some believed it had been stolen by collectors who knew its value. Marvin never spoke publicly about that night. In interviews throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, when asked about his influences, he would mention Chuck Berry among others, but always in general terms. He never referenced the session, never hinted at what had been created. But people who knew him well noticed that whenever Johnny B. Goode played on the radio or in a bar, Marvin would go quiet. He would listen with an intensity that suggested he was hearing something more than what was actually there. He was remembering a version that only 3 people had ever heard. Chuck Berry, characteristically guarded about his personal life and creative process, also remained silent. In his autobiography, published years after the session, there's a single paragraph about working with Marvin Gaye on the Born to Rock special. It describes Marvin as professional and talented. Nothing more. No mention of what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. No reference to the tape that captured something unprecedented. The silence surrounding the session has made it a legend among music historians and collectors. Some claim to have heard bootleg copies. Others insist the whole story is fabricated, that nothing happened after the official taping ended. But there are too many corroborating details. Too many people who remember David the engineer talking about it. Too many small confirmations from musicians who worked with both Marvin and Chuck during that period. What the session represented was larger than just a lost recording. It was evidence of the prison that commercial success creates for artists. Both Marvin and Chuck had achieved incredible things within the structures of the music industry. But those structures also limited them, defined them, kept them in lanes that were profitable and predictable. That night in the studio, off the record, away from oversight, they broke free. And the fact that the result of that freedom couldn't be shared, couldn't be sold, couldn't be fit into any existing category, says everything about why artists like Marvin struggled so deeply with the expectations placed on them. The tragedy isn't that the tape was lost or destroyed or hidden. The tragedy is that it had to be. That the music industry in 1973 had no space for something that blurred boundaries, that resisted categorization, that valued artistic exploration over commercial viability. Marvin spent the rest of his career fighting for creative control, for the right to make music that expressed his full range, rather than just the romantic persona Motown preferred. What's going on was his victory in that fight, but the Chuck Berry session was his rebellion, a private moment of freedom that he couldn't turn into a public statement. Today, collectors still search for the tape. Music historians still debate whether it exists. And musicians who understand what it must have sounded like, based on descriptions from those who were there, dream about what could have been learned from it. Not just about Marvin's versatility or Chuck's willingness to collaborate, but about the artificial divisions that separate musical genres and the magic that happens when those divisions are ignored. The session remains a ghost, a story passed between people who care about music history, a reminder that some of the most important artistic moments happen in private, away from audiences and critics and commercial pressures. And sometimes those moments stay private, not because they should, but because the world isn't ready to receive them. Somewhere, perhaps, the tape still exists, in a forgotten archive, in a collector's vault, in a box that nobody has thought to open. And if it ever surfaces, it will reveal what people who were there already know. That on one night in 1973, two men who had spent their lives being told who they were supposed to be, finally got to be who they actually were. And the sound they created was worth more than anything either of them ever released.